I'm a bit of a pack rat, and among the items I've framed and hung in my walls of my home, a series of dinner menus from Pan Am, each featuring a watercolor painting of one of their noted aircraft. You'll see these menus in this talk. For its first 40 years, the Pan American saga is also the story of the legendary Juan Trippe, a man born in 1899. He was the son of an engineer from an old family in America, who later became an investment banker. His mother's family had a more colorful history, which I'll describe in a few moments. On the right, you see him on the Yale University varsity football team, and on the left is a young naval aviator. He trained for the Navy, but didn't get to Europe before the war ended. At Yale, he became friends with many well-heeled young men who would later help finance Pan Am's growth. People like Sonny Whitney, a wealthy Wall Street operator. In the early days of commercial aviation, airlines were put together by promoters, and Trippe was an archetypal promoter. But he had the additional quality of being dogged and always paying attention to every detail. And he also had a long-term vision, wanting to create an airline that would literally fly everywhere in the world. Since much early aviation activity was tied to the awarding of airmail contracts, Trippe also became a consummate Washington insider. This diagram shows the complicated structure of corporations and entrepreneurs that brought about the business that came to be called Pan American Airways. All of these pieces in the organizational chart were tied to the awarding of the right to carry airmail between Cuba and the US. As this and other situations sorted themselves out, Trippe proved adept at always holding a trump card. In the case of Pan Am's initial route between Key West and Havana, Trippe had previously visited the president of Cuba and charmed him into signing a letter giving Trippe, personally, the rights to fly Cuban mail. He kept that a secret, but when push came to shove, this letter was Trippe's trump card. This graphic also makes the point that at each stage of the development, Pan Am devoured competitors. And when the inaugural flight took place, it was in an airplane named for General Mercado, the president of Cuba. Within just 2 years of that first flight, Pan Am had a route network of 12,000 miles, flying to 23 countries. And here's an example of how Trippe became a skilled Washington operator. Virtually every First Lady christened one of Trippe's new aircraft. Here you see President Coolidge's wife christening one of Pan Am's Fokker F-7s. Pan Am's other F-7 was named after Postmaster General New, who's shown on the far right of this picture. This map gives you a perspective of how tiny Pan Am's start was. The first route from Key West to Havana was only 90 miles. Later that year, Pan Am switched its Havana service from Key West to Miami. Although in earlier years, Trippe had been involved in the fight for Boston to New York airmail contract, he soon turned his attention to operating outside the US because he sensed that there would be more institutional barriers to overseas services that he could deal with to his advantage. Through meetings with foreign governments and lobbying in Washington, Trippe subtly promoted the idea that Pan Am should be the United States government's chosen instrument in terms of being the primary US airline that should fly to other countries. At one point, Trippe's brother-in-law was FDR's Secretary of State, which also didn't hurt. Now here we see Charles Lindbergh, Time Magazine's Man of the Year, and the world's most famous man after flying nonstop across the Atlantic to Paris. He toured the US and the world extensively and was probably the most popular man in the world. While various corporations aggressively courted Lindbergh, Trippe slowly ingratiated himself with Lindbergh due to their shared interest in flying. But when the time was right, Lindbergh was hired as a consultant to Pan Am for $10,000 a year, which was the equivalent to about $150,000 in today's money. Trippe and his wife Betty undertook a 2,000-mile scouting journey with the Lindberghs, surveying various possible routes in Latin America. Lindbergh had married the daughter of Dwight Morrow, a J.P. Morgan partner, as well as a well-regarded diplomat. Another important player in the development of aviation was the Russian Igor Sikorsky. Before he became famous for pioneering helicopters, Sikorsky was responsible for many other aviation innovations, such as this first multi-engine powered aircraft in 1913. The most striking feature of this craft was that it had an open-air balcony in the front of the plane. It was wondered if seats in the balcony were ever sold to passengers. Now here's the Sikorsky S-38, the aircraft that Lindbergh and Tripp used flying around Latin America. It was an amphibian that could land on water, but could also become a land plane by cranking the side wheels down. Later, Sikorsky developed the S-40 flying boat to specifications given by Tripp and Lindbergh. Early on, Tripp decided to call his planes Clippers, and he gave each of the Clippers a name. He also strived to create an image for Pan Am's professionals. Pan Am's pilots were called captains, and the co-pilots were first officers. They wore blue uniforms like U.S. Navy officers and white hats. The first area that Pan Am grew in was Latin America. Tripp used any and all means to grow. As he expanded in Latin America, he promoted a joint venture with W.R. Grace called Panagra, to develop a route system on the Pacific side of South America. For the Atlantic side, he absorbed a competitor that had gotten into financial difficulties. As Pan Am grew throughout Latin America, his managers wanted to play up Tripp's Hispanic first name, but he insisted that he be listed just as J.T. Tripp. He always hated the name Juan and claimed he spoke no Spanish. Tripp's grandmother was a young barmaid in Liverpool who married a notorious American bank robber. After he died, she married a wealthy Venezuelan man worth about $100 million. His name was Juan Terry, and he took her two daughters from the previous marriage under his wing, and then they had a third daughter named Juanita, for whom he left the bulk of his fortune in trust. As his mother's firstborn, she named her son Juan Terry Tripp. Later, he resented Yale classmates who teased him by calling him Yang. Tripp was successful in having Pan Am become that chosen instrument for winning virtually all of the United States foreign airmail routes. But he made many enemies in the U.S. government, both in the Congress and with whomever was in the White House. These enemies were determined to never let Pan Am have any domestic routes. The S-42 was a further improvement on the S-40 and could carry 32 passengers cruising at 140 miles an hour. It broke all distance records at the time and was later used to pioneer both transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes. With the lock on the Latin American aviation market, Tripp expanded his horizons, hoping to cross both the Pacific and the Atlantic. Tripp was famous for figuring out how to cross oceans. In the New York Public Library, he discovered a tiny island called Wake in the Pacific that was owned by the U.S. Navy. He managed to secure a contract to lease that island from the Navy. As he contemplated service across the Pacific, he realized he'd have to find stepping stones where his clippers could stop to take on fuel. Here you see an analysis of the distances involved. The longest distance was from California to Hawaii, about 2,400 miles. From the Hawaii, the rest of the Pacific would be crossed with a few shorter hops to Midway, Wake, and Guam. So in the early days of the Pacific service, only a handful of passengers could be on the flight to Honolulu. The rest would have to take a ship to Honolulu in advance. Tripp organized sending a ship to set up facilities on these islands. It took 2 months of planning in his Chrysler Building office and an expenditure of $1 million. The 6,700-ton ship, the North Haven, set sail with a dormitory for 112 workers, plus the ship's crew. For Honolulu and Manila, they just had to construct radio navigation and communications facilities. But on Midway and Wake, they had to build seaplane bases from scratch. Midway had an existing cable station, but Wake was uninhabited. For Wake and Midway, the ship carried 12 prefabricated buildings for each, as well as 4,000-gallon tanks for both aviation gas and water. for each island. They also carried 6 months' worth of food for Midway and Wake in huge refrigerators. And they brought 80 construction workers plus 12 Pan Am employees who would run the two bases. Here's a picture of the North Haven anchored off Wake while supplies were being unloaded. And here's the dock that was built at Wake Island. On each of these island stops, passengers stayed at hotels built by Pan Am, using materials and men carried by the North Haven. With these preparations made, in this picture we see a ceremony in San Francisco in November 1935, inaugurating the first airmail service across the Pacific with the China Clipper. Pan Am service across the Pacific started in 1935. The longest leg was San Francisco to Honolulu, which could take as long as 24 hours. Then after refueling stops in Midway, Wake, and Guam, the Clipper ended up in Manila. The first passenger service came a year later, in 1936. The Philippine Clipper was a Martin M130 bought by Pan Am. Tripp was a hard negotiator and parsimonious with aircraft manufacturers. Despite developing the M130 that opened the Pacific to Pan Am, Tripp only ordered 3 of them, and Martin declined to develop any additional flying boats for Pan Am. Instead, Tripp had Boeing develop a larger flying boat, the B-314, which you see here about to be christened by Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt, who's patiently listening to Tripp's speechifying. The Boeing 314 had a range of 3,500 miles and could carry 74 passengers. Eventually, Boeing built 12 of these for Pan Am. They were initially deployed in the Pacific on the routes that Pan Am had already pioneered. The North Atlantic posed a bigger challenge than crossing the Pacific. Not only was the weather a much bigger problem than the Pacific, but there were fewer stepping stone islands to use. And there was lots of politics involved, having to deal with many European countries. Most European countries had a government-controlled monopoly that Tripp had to contend with. Also holding Tripp back on the Atlantic was an understanding Tripp had made with the British that Pan Am wouldn't inaugurate service until Britain was able to establish service as well. Transatlantic service was finally commenced in June 1939 when the Dixie Clipper flew from New York to Lisbon. However, when war came less than 3 months later, the service was interrupted, and eventually the US government took over Pan Am's Boeings. After I first gave this talk 3 years ago, I came across a treasure trove of wonderful pictures of life aboard these Boeing Clippers during that short time they were in service. Now here's a cutaway diagram, and as I said before, the Clipper could carry 74 passengers in luxury. The seats could be converted to 40 sleepers with upper and lower bunks, along with curtains for privacy. The Clipper had a spacious flight deck where the pilots, flight engineers, navigators, and radio men worked. There were less elegant sleeping facilities for the crew that you see here. Passengers had access to dressing rooms, which you see in the photo on the left, as well as a ladies' lounge for makeup, seen on the right. But probably the ultimate luxury was a separate sit-down dining room. Now, I like this illustration because it gives us a good sense of the progression of Pan Am's flying boats in comparison to the DC-3, which you see in the upper right, which was a small airplane. The DC-3 was the staple of domestic airlines, and the domestic aviation system was years behind Pan Am in terms of their aircraft and the services they offered. And speaking of the DC-3, Pan Am was a part owner of China National Airways, and one of its DC-3s lost a wing when it was shot down. When it came time to repair this warhorse, the only spare wing they could find was from a DC-2, which they bolted on, and it managed to fly. It was dubbed the DC-2.5. By 1940, Pan American had become the world's largest airline by route miles, passengers carried, and revenues. All of this had occurred in only 12 years after its very first 90-mile flight in 1928. During World War II, Pan American became indispensable to the U.S. war effort. And here you see FDR celebrating his 61st birthday in that same dining compartment on the Boeing 314, flying to the Casablanca conference, the first time a president had flown while in office. Tripp turned down an offer to become a general in the Army Air Force, preferring to continue running Pan Am. And Pan Am built over 50 airports along the routes in the Caribbean, Brazil, and Africa that were used by the military. My father attended the Casablanca conference, flying over in a Sikorsky S-42 via the Brazil and Africa route. He gave me these keepsakes, which were called short snorters. Among the ways the officials would pass the time was by circulating dollar bills, which each person would sign as souvenirs. Unfortunately, I never thought to ask my dad who these people were that he's flying with, and the signatures are not legible. Pan Am's early development had all been in flying boats, but World War II had seen great advances in land planes, which Pan Am embraced. Here you see the 4-engine DC-4 that Pan Am used in establishing service between New York and Leopoldville in the Congo, with stops in Newfoundland, Lisbon, and Dakar. By 1947, Pan Am was flying the Lockheed Constellation, and by this time, all of Pan Am's operations were operated by land planes. Pan Am inaugurated the first round-the-globe service. The entire trip took just under 94 flying hours, spread over a period of 12 days, stopping in 17 cities and 10 countries. Here's a map showing that round-the-world service from the vantage point of a polar map. Pan Am introduced a Boeing airplane called the Stratocruiser, which was based on a successful bomber design. It became popular because its double-deck configuration offered a number of passenger amenities, such as a lounge located on the lower level. It also had bunks for sleeping on the transatlantic runs, which still took many hours and involved 1 or 2 stops to refuel. And of course, Pan Am managed to get Evita Peron at the right, the wife of Argentina's ever-smiling dictator, Juan Perón, to christen a Stratocruiser in Buenos Aires in 1950. Using prop planes, Pan Am had developed an extensive worldwide route network. However, in the post-war period, Pan Am had lost its coveted position as the chosen instrument for America's overseas aviation. In particular, TWA, now controlled by Howard Hughes, was a keen competitor in international service. But Pan Am retained its edge by always being first to acquire new aircraft. After the DC-4, there had only been a limited edition of DC-5s, but the DC-6 was very successfully developed in the 1950s. The ultimate prop plane was the DC-7C, which Pan Am called the 7 Cs. It could carry 84 passengers and had a range of 4,000 statute miles. Some Pan Am planes or ads claimed no goose, no gander, meaning crossing the Atlantic non-stop without refueling in Goose Bay or Gander, Newfoundland, but only if all the conditions were right. Most of Pan Am's competitors were government-owned monopolies like British Overseas Airways, BOAC, and Air France that were content to cater to the carriage trade with first-class service. But Tripp had a vision for mass air travel, and he fought to introduce cheaper tourist-class service across the Atlantic, a battle he eventually won after several years. This graph documents the demise of the North Atlantic passenger liners due to the introduction of jet aircraft. Much of the growth took place using 4-engine prop planes like the Lockheed Constellation, and the DC-6 and DC-7. However, as you see in the chart, the growth really took off after the introduction of jetliners in the late 50s. And these were jetliners led by Pan Am. Jet engines had been developed during World War II, but many in civil aviation doubted jets would ever be economic for the airlines. The British designed and built Comet was the first jet airliner. was introduced into service in 1952, but it seated less than 50 passengers. One trip ordered 3 Comets, strictly as a defensive measure. Later, they were grounded after 3 Comets crashed due to metal fatigue, a new phenomena that jet aircraft experience due to their higher altitudes, due to pressurization. Tripp was a believer in jet aircraft, but he was holding out for a jet that could fly transatlantic nonstop and could carry 180 passengers so he could offer his tourist class fares. Boeing had developed the large B-52 bomber and was now planning a jetliner, but it had decided on a fuselage that would only seat 5 to a row, meaning it would carry less than 180 passengers. Douglas was developing a jet that would seat 6 to a row, but neither company could promise a plane that could fly nonstop across the Atlantic, given Pratt & Whitney's jet engines available at the time. Tripp found out that Pratt & Whitney was developing a much larger jet engine, the J-75, for the military, but they weren't planning on an airliner version. Tripp finally brought them around. He invited them to a luncheon, and at the luncheon he presented a check for $40 million and gave them an order for 120 engines, even though he hadn't ordered any airplanes yet. With the firm order in place for the necessary jet engines, Tripp embarked on a round of negotiations with both Boeing and Douglas in October 1955. Boeing refused to budge on changing to 6 abreast, so Tripp ordered 21 of their smaller aircraft. Then, the same day, he went to Douglas, and with the more powerful engines, they agreed to produce the DC-8, which would seat 6 abreast and be able to fly nonstop across the Atlantic. Well, Tripp ordered 24 DC-8s. Tripp signed contracts with Boeing and Douglas on the same day, but neither manufacturer was aware of Tripp's contract with the other. On October 13, 1955, at the annual meeting of the International Air Transport Association, he announced both orders, and he made a point that the Douglas jetliners would be capable of flying nonstop across the Atlantic. To salvage its position, Boeing had to switch its design to the bigger 6 across transoceanic airliner, which they called the 707. The 45 planes that Tripp had ordered from the 2 jet suppliers gave Pan Am an incredible head start as the world's airlines were forced to enter the jet age. By the way, as a teenager, I was always keen on identifying models of aircraft. You could tell the DC-8 apart because it had much larger windows, as you see in this picture. In addition to the 707's very small windows to protect against the wind blowing up, the 707 had a distinctive forward jutting antenna jutting forward from the top of the tail. This is one of my favorite pictures here of a 707 in Pan Am's original livery before they opted for a more modern version. Swimmers at the St. Martin Beach still get quite a few close flybys every day. So as not to offend the friendly competitors in Britain, Tripp scheduled the inaugural flight of the 707 from New York to Paris in October 1958. And of course he arranged to have the first 707 christened by Mamie Eisenhower, who you see on the right being entertained by Juan and Betty Tripp. And so, 3 years after placing his jet orders, Pan Am was able to kick off the jet age in December 1958 with a nonstop flight from New York to Paris. Now here's a map showing the extent of Pan Am's jet service just 2 years later in 1960. Pan Am had the most jets first and was able to introduce jet service worldwide quickly. It took years for competing airlines to catch up to Pan Am. With all of these new jets, airline terminals had to get much bigger. And in this picture, you see the terminal that TWA built at JFK. It was designed by Eero Saarinen, and it's a beautiful building, and recently it's been restored, and now it's open as a hotel. But although it was beautiful, there were long walks to get to your airplane. Pan Am came up with an excellent alternative that it called the Worldport. All the jets could nose into a central terminal. While it lasted, it was incredibly convenient. I chose this photograph to illustrate what a short walk it was from the Worldport to a waiting jet. But I have to ask if anyone is old enough to remember when Liz Taylor took on Eddie Finisher as her fourth husband in 1959 after her third husband, Mike Todd, died in a plane crash. Eddie had been married to Liz's close friend at the time, Debbie Reynolds. With its strong cash flow in the early 60s, Tripp was able to find lucrative investments. He made a deal with developers of a huge building on top of Grand Central Station. He agreed to Pan Am being the lead tenant, but insisted the building be turned sideways, dominating the view of Park Avenue. He also got Pan Am an equity interest in the building, which Pan Am later was able to sell for over $500 million. He wanted Pan Am's name to be in 30-foot high letters, and the city fathers finally compromised, allowing 15-foot high letters. And note the helipad at the top, which offered a quick trip to JFK in 8 minutes. Tripp also built a worldwide chain of hotels called Intercontinental Hotels. But by far the biggest deal that Tripp ever undertook was to place the first order for the Mammoth 747. He stunned the aviation world by ordering 25 of these new planes, seen here landing in London after its inaugural flight from New York City. However, the 747 deliveries to Pan Am came just as the rapid growth in air traffic had started to taper off, while the economy was headed into a recession. Here's one of my favorite pictures that shows the incredible jump in size from the 707 to the 747. The immense size of the 747 rendered Pan Am's innovative Worldport obsolete. As you can see here, a huge addition had to be made, making Pan Am's terminal very inefficient with long walks to get to your flight. Tripp is also a big believer in the need to develop a supersonic transport, and here you see an artist's conception. During discussions about the SST, he met Najib Halaby, then the Federal Aviation Administrator. Tripp was particularly impressed when Halaby received a call from President Kennedy while he was in Tripp's office. Tripp decided on the spot to hire Halaby, but he didn't give him any specific duties other than lobbying. But then everything changed in 1968 on the day of Pan Am's annual meeting. Tripp, without telling anyone, not even his secretary, announced he was retiring as president of Pan Am. His successor was Harold Gray, who you see on the left, who had started as a pilot, later becoming chief pilot before joining management. And on the right is Najib Halaby, the former FAA administrator. Gray died of cancer within 2 years, and Halaby became CEO. Some criticized Tripp for not having focused on selecting a capable successor, a common weakness among great entrepreneurs. Some even criticized Tripp for getting out just before the company started to lose vast sums of money. But that's probably an unfair criticism, because Tripp had dealt with challenging situations before, and he had great financial skills. In retrospect, Tripp's order of 25 747s was probably what brought about the demise of Pan Am. The planes just couldn't be filled. Halaby compounded the problem by ordering more 747s, and later ordering a special long-range version called the 747 SP for special performance. Halaby also ordered the Lockheed 1011 Tri-Jet to deploy on shorter routes, such as those to Latin America. But when Pan Am made the ill-advised purchase of National Airlines, they suddenly owned National's fleet of DC-10 Tri-Jets. Acquiring National had been a desperate attempt to obtain domestic routes, but in the era of deregulation that started in 1978, Pan Am could have obtained routes without buying National. The demise of Pan Am took 20 years. In some ways, it was like watching a movie being run backwards at high speed. Tripp died in 1981, and this graph shows a particularly difficult time for the airline in 1980 and 81. But note that in late 1980, it had a large profit from the gain on selling the Pan Am building. The name on the building was changed to MetLife. Then Pan Am had another huge gain in 1981 from the sale of the Intercontinental Hotel chain. The Trip had started and built up over the years. Here you can see the huge worldwide network that Intercontinental had become. To stay in business, Pan Am ended up conducting fire sales. First, Pan Am sold its key Asian routes to United, and then Pan Am later sold many European routes to Delta. The end would come in late 1991 when Pan Am completed its last flight, a short hop from Barbados to Miami on a small 727. Tomorrow I'll be back in the Princess Theater at a special time. The very first cruises that I spoke on were to Cuba 3.5 years ago. One of the talks I developed for those cruises focused on John F. Kennedy and his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the current crisis, a key concern is that the situation in the Ukraine might escalate into a nuclear showdown that could trigger World War III. Because of this anxiety about nuclear escalation, I decided to take another look at the Cuban crisis of 1962 that did bring the world as close as it's ever been to a nuclear war. So tomorrow at a special time, 10 a.m., here in the Princess Theater, I'll take a look at the challenges JFK faced during the showdown over Soviet missiles in Cuba. Thank you for coming today, and I've enjoyed having the chance to meet many of you during this crossing.